They thought it was just a black man's cabin by the lake. They thought they could push him around, silence him, and make him disappear. But what they found inside that wooden door changed everything. The truth didn't just shock them, it shook the entire town to its core. The sound of car doors slamming cut through the peaceful morning air like gunshots. Marcus Williams looked up from his coffee, watching through the window as 3 white SUVs pulled into his driveway. His lakeside cabin had been quiet for months, exactly how he liked it. But now, trouble was coming straight to his front door. Marcus had bought this place after 20 years of working double shifts at the steel plant. He saved every penny, dreaming of a spot where he could fish in peace and watch his grandkids play by the water. The cabin wasn't fancy, just wood walls, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over the crystal blue lake. But it was his. Every nail, every board, every memory he'd made here belonged to him. The first person out of the lead SUV was Patricia Hendricks, president of the Clearwater Lake Community Association. She wore a crisp white suit and carried a thick folder like a weapon. Behind her came 2 more board members, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. From the other cars stepped 4 police officers, hands resting on their belts, faces hard as stone. Marcus set down his coffee and walked to the door. His heart was beating fast, but his face stayed calm. He'd learnt long ago that staying calm was the only way to survive moments like this. He opened the door before they could knock. "Morning, Patricia," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Quite a crowd you brought with you." Patricia's eyes were cold as winter ice. "Mr. Williams, we need to discuss your violations immediately. You've ignored our letters, our calls, and our warnings. This ends today." Marcus didn't step back. He'd dealt with people like Patricia his whole life. People who thought his skin color made him easy to push around. "What violations?" "I've followed every rule in that book of yours." "Your dock," Patricia snapped. "It's 3 feet longer than regulations allow. Your fire pit is in the wrong location. And your boat storage violates our aesthetic guidelines." One of the police officers stepped forward. "Sir, we're here to ensure this situation doesn't escalate. We'd appreciate your cooperation." Marcus looked at the officer, a young man who wouldn't meet his eyes. "Cooperation with what?" "Last I checked, this was still America, and this is still my property." Patricia's voice got sharper. "Your property is part of our community, Mr. Williams. You signed an agreement to follow our rules when you bought this place. Rules that maintain property values and keep our neighborhood safe." "Safe from what?" Marcus asked, the question hanging in the morning air. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what wasn't being said. Safe from him. Safe from people like him. But Marcus wasn't backing down. "Not today. Not ever again. I want to see the exact measurements," he said calmly. "I want to see the documentation that shows I'm violating anything. And I want to know why my dock gets measured when half the white folks around this lake have docks twice the size of mine." Patricia's face flushed red. "This isn't about race, Mr. Williams. This is about following rules." "Whose rules?" Marcus asked. "The ones that get enforced on some people but not others?" The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The police officers looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. The board members whispered to each other. Patricia clutched her folder tighter, like it could protect her from the truth everyone could feel, but no one wanted to say out loud. But Marcus had a secret they didn't know about. Inside his cabin, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of legal papers, was someone who would change everything. Someone whose presence would turn their morning of intimidation into their worst nightmare. The sound of footsteps came from inside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps walking toward the front door. "Marcus!" a voice called from inside, deep and authoritative. "Everything all right out there?" Patricia frowned, craning her neck to see past Marcus into the cabin. "Who's that?" Marcus stepped aside just enough to let the man behind him come into view. And when he did, the color drained from every face in that driveway. Standing in the doorway, tall and commanding in a perfectly pressed suit, was federal judge Robert Coleman. Not just any judge, the same judge who'd been making headlines for his rulings on civil rights cases. The same judge whose photograph had been on the front page of newspapers across 3 states. The same judge who had the power to change lives with a single decision. Judge Coleman looked out at the crowd with calm, measuring eyes. "Good morning, officers. Ms. Hendricks, isn't it? I believe we need to have a conversation." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the lake water lapping against the shore. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The police officers suddenly found their shoes very interesting to look at. Marcus felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. They'd come here thinking they were dealing with just another black man they could intimidate and push around. Instead, they'd walked straight into a meeting with one of the most powerful judges in the federal court system. Judge Coleman had been Marcus's neighbor for months, but nobody knew it. The judge owned the cabin on the other side of the small inlet, hidden behind trees and accessible only by water. They'd become friends during long evenings fishing, sharing stories about their families, their struggles, and their hopes for a better world. When Marcus had told him about the harassment from the community association, Judge Coleman had offered to help. Not as a judge, but as a friend and neighbor who understood what it meant to face discrimination. But now, seeing the police officers and the intimidation tactics, the judge's role was about to become much more official. "I think," Judge Coleman said, his voice carrying the weight of years on the federal bench, "we need to discuss what constitutes harassment under federal law, and what happens when community associations use selective enforcement to target residents based on protected characteristics." Patricia's folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the wooden deck like autumn leaves. The morning that was supposed to end with Marcus being forced from his cabin had just become something none of them were prepared for. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't the one they'd been expecting. Judge Coleman stepped fully onto the porch, and the morning air seemed to change around him. This wasn't just any federal judge. This was a man whose decisions had shaped civil rights law for over 2 decades. Patricia Hendricks and her crew had come expecting to intimidate a lone black man. Instead, they were facing someone who could end careers with a phone call. "Officers," Judge Coleman said, his voice polite but firm, "I'm curious about the probable cause for this visit. Has Mr. Williams been accused of a crime?" The lead officer, Sergeant Mike Torres, shifted uncomfortably. "No, sir. We're here for a civil matter. The Homeowners Association requested our presence to prevent any potential conflicts." "Prevent conflicts?" Judge Coleman raised an eyebrow. "Or intimidate a homeowner into compliance? Because from where I stand, 4 armed officers seem like excessive force for a conversation about dock measurements." Patricia found her voice, though it cracked slightly. "Judge Coleman, I had no idea you were here. This is simply association business. Mr. Williams has repeatedly violated our community standards." Marcus spoke up, his voice steady. "Judge, Patricia here claims my dock is 3 feet too long, but the Hendersons' dock, right over there, is twice the size of mine. The Johnsons added a boat lift last month without any permits, and the Weatherbys built an entire 2nd-story deck that blocks half the lake view. But somehow those don't violate community standards." Judge Coleman nodded slowly. "Selective enforcement. I see." He looked directly at Patricia. "Ms. Hendricks, how long has Mr. Williams lived here?" "About 18 months, Patricia answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And how many violation notices has he received in those 18 months? Patricia clutched her remaining papers. I don't have exact numbers with me." Marcus walked into his cabin and returned with a cardboard box. "I do. 17 letters, Patricia. 17 different violations in 18 months. Everything from my mailbox being the wrong color to my grass being too tall after a week of rain." Judge Coleman examined several of the letters, his expression growing darker with each one. "Fascinating. And Miss Hendricks, how many violation notices have you sent to other residents during that same time period?" The silence stretched until it became an answer itself. "I thought so," Judge Coleman said. "Mr. Williams, would you mind sharing some of these specific complaints with our guests?" Marcus pulled out a letter dated 6 months earlier. "This one says my outdoor furniture doesn't match the community aesthetic. I had 2 plastic chairs on my deck, the same chairs they sell at the hardware store in town. But apparently they were the wrong shade of green." He pulled out another. "This one fined me $50 because my trash can was visible from the street. It was Tuesday, trash day. The can was at the curb where it's supposed to be, but somehow that violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Judge Coleman's jaw tightened as Marcus continued. "Here's my favorite," Marcus said, holding up a letter with official letterhead. "A formal complaint because I was playing music on my deck during a family barbecue at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. The music was so loud you had to strain to hear it from the next cabin over. But 5 homes down, the Petersons had a party that lasted until midnight with a live band, and that was perfectly fine." Patricia's face had gone pale. "Those were different circumstances." "Different how?" Judge Coleman asked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Different because the Petersons are white?" One of the board members, an older man named Frank Dalton, stepped forward. "Now wait just a minute. This association has never discriminated based on race. We have rules that apply to everyone equally." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Equally? Frank, your son built an entire workshop behind your house without a single permit. It's been there for 2 years. Where's his violation notice?" Frank's mouth opened and closed without sound. Judge Coleman pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of the letters. "What we have here is a documented pattern of harassment targeting a single resident. 17 violations in 18 months, compared to 0 violations for comparable or worse infractions by other residents. In legal terms, this constitutes prima facie evidence of discriminatory enforcement." Sergeant Torres cleared his throat. "Sir, we were told this was about community standards, not discrimination." "And that's exactly the problem, Sergeant," Judge Coleman replied. "When community standards are applied selectively based on race, they become tools of discrimination. And when law enforcement is used to intimidate citizens exercising their legal rights, that becomes a federal civil rights violation." Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. "We never meant—" "Intent is irrelevant," Judge Coleman said firmly. "Impact is what matters under the law, and the impact has been clear. Systematic harassment designed to make one resident so uncomfortable that he would leave." Marcus felt something shift inside him. For months, he'd wondered if he was being paranoid, if the constant letters and complaints were just bad luck. But hearing Judge Coleman lay out the pattern in legal terms, he realized he'd been right all along. This wasn't about rules or community standards. This was about them not wanting him in their neighborhood. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. He reached into the box and pulled out a recording device. "I started recording our phone conversations after the 5th complaint letter." Judge Coleman's eyebrows rose. "With their knowledge, I hope?" "South Carolina is a one-party consent state," Marcus replied. "I only recorded conversations I was part of, and I announced I was recording each time." He pressed play on the device. Patricia's voice filled the morning air, sharp and angry. "Mr. Williams, people are starting to complain about your presence in the neighborhood. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, somewhere more suited to your lifestyle?" Marcus pressed stop. "That was 3 months ago, after I had the audacity to invite my church friends over for a fish fry." Judge Coleman's expression had turned stone cold. "Miss Hendricks, did you just hear yourself suggesting that Mr. Williams would be more comfortable elsewhere based on his lifestyle? What exactly did you mean by that?" Patricia was shaking now. That's not what I meant. I was talking about the noise, the number of cars." "The same number of cars that show up when the Weatherbees have their monthly poker night?" Marcus asked. "The same noise level as the Hendersons' grandchildren when they visit every weekend?" Judge Coleman began pacing the porch, and everyone could feel the weight of his years on the federal bench. "What we have documented here is not just selective enforcement. It's harassment based on racial bias. The pattern is clear, the evidence is recorded, and the intimidation tactics speak for themselves." He turned to face the police officers. "Gentlemen, I strongly suggest you reconsider your role in this situation. Using law enforcement to intimidate a citizen exercising his legal property rights could result in federal civil rights charges." The officers exchanged worried glances. This had gone far beyond a simple community dispute. Patricia made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Judge Coleman, surely you can understand our position. We're trying to maintain property values and community standards. Everyone agreed to these rules when they bought their homes. Everyone agreed to the same rules," Judge Coleman corrected. "But those rules haven't been enforced equally. And that selective enforcement, based on racial bias, violates both federal civil rights law and basic principles of justice." Marcus looked out over the lake, the morning sun glinting off the water. When he'd bought this cabin, he'd dreamed of peaceful mornings just like this one. Instead, he'd been fighting a war he never wanted. against people who saw his skin color as a threat to their perfect little world. But now, with Judge Coleman standing beside him and the evidence spread out for everyone to see, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not just hope for himself, but hope that other people facing the same kind of harassment might finally have a voice. The morning that had started with intimidation was turning into something much bigger, and Patricia Hendricks was beginning to realize that her perfect little world was about to come crashing down around her. Judge Coleman walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the lake, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned around, his face carried the expression of a man who'd seen too many injustices to let another one slide by. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air with judicial authority, "I want you to understand something very clearly. What's happening here isn't just about community association rules. This is about civil rights, federal law, and the kind of discrimination that my court has been fighting for decades." Patricia's hands trembled as she tried to gather the scattered papers from her dropped folder. "Judge Coleman, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not discriminating against anyone. We simply have standards that everyone must follow." "Everyone." Marcus stepped forward, his voice stronger now. "Let me tell you about everyone, Patricia." He pulled out his phone and showed them photos he'd been taking around the lake. "Here's the Morrison place. The dock extends 15 feet past the property line. The boat lift was installed without permits, and they've got a deck that's twice the size allowed in your precious rule book." "How many letters did they get?" Patricia wouldn't meet his eyes. "Here's the Taylor cabin," Marcus continued, swiping to the next photo. "They built an entire guest house without association approval. Added solar panels that don't match your aesthetic guidelines. Put in a hot tub that required electrical work. 0 violation notices." Judge Coleman examined the photos with the careful attention of a federal judge reviewing evidence. "Mr. Williams, how long did it take you to document these violations?" 2 hours, Marcus said. 2 hours walking around the lake with my camera. Every single one of these properties has violations that are worse than anything I've been accused of. But somehow, I'm the only one getting letters." One of the police officers, a younger man who'd been silent until now, stepped forward. "Ma'am, if this is true, why are we here? Why did you call us for a civil dispute?" Patricia's voice cracked. I was told he might become hostile, that he had a history of confrontational behavior." "Confrontational behavior?" Marcus's voice rose for the first time that morning. "Like what, Patricia? Like asking questions when you send me violation notices for things that aren't violations? Like requesting documentation when you fine me for having friends over?" Judge Coleman held up his hand. "Mr. Williams told me about an incident last month." "Ms. Hendricks, would you care to explain why you called the police when he was hosting his nephew's birthday party?" Patricia's face flushed red. "There were too many cars. The noise level was inappropriate for a residential area." Marcus pulled out another recording device. "Judge, here's the call she made to the police that day." Patricia's recorded voice filled the morning air. "There's a situation at the Williams cabin. Large gathering of people in multiple vehicles, and they're being loud and disruptive. I'm concerned about safety issues and potential criminal activity." Judge Coleman's eyes flashed with anger. "Criminal activity? At a child's birthday party?" "The responding officer," Marcus continued, "arrived to find 12 people, mostly family members, having cake and playing games on my lawn. My 8-year-old nephew was opening presents. The officer stayed for 10 minutes, said everything looked perfectly normal, and left. But Patricia here filed a formal complaint anyway." Sergeant Torres frowned. "I remember that call. Officer Jensen said it was just a family party. No noise violations, no problems whatsoever. Patricia was backed into a corner, and everyone could see it. I was concerned about the neighborhood." "You were concerned about black people existing in your neighborhood," Judge Coleman said bluntly. "And now you've involved law enforcement in what amounts to racial harassment." The truth was spreading across the faces of everyone present like water soaking into dry ground. The board members looked horrified. The police officers looked angry at being used. And Patricia looked like a woman whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. Marcus felt the weight of 18 months of frustration and anger building in his chest. "You want to know what this is really about? It's not about my dock or my music or my trash cans. It's about the fact that when you look at me, you see a threat. When my family visits, you see criminals. When I play music, you hear noise. When white folks do the exact same things, you see community and family and normal life. Frank Dalton, the board member who'd tried to defend Patricia earlier, was looking at the evidence with growing horror. Patricia, is this true? Have we really been targeting Marcus unfairly? I've been doing my job, Patricia said, but her voice had lost all its authority. Your job isn't to make one resident feel unwelcome based on his race, Judge Coleman said firmly. Your job is to enforce rules equally and fairly, and the evidence shows you've done neither. Marcus walked to his dock and gestured for everyone to follow. Come on, let's go look at this supposedly illegal dock extension. The group walked down to the water's edge where Marcus's simple wooden dock stretched into the lake. He pulled out a measuring tape and showed them the distance from his property line. 32 feet, he announced. Association rules allow 35 feet. My dock is 3 feet shorter than what's allowed. Patricia's mouth fell open. But the complaint said... The complaint was wrong, Judge Coleman said coldly. Just like most of the complaints you filed against Mr. Williams. Did you ever actually measure his dock before accusing him of violations? The silence was deafening. Marcus measured the dock again, this time with everyone watching. 32 feet. 3 feet under the limit. And here's what's interesting. I built it short on purpose because I was so worried about getting another violation notice from Patricia. One of the police officers shook his head in disgust. Ma'am, we've been called out here multiple times based on false information. Judge Coleman's phone rang. He answered it with a crisp "Coleman here" and listened for a moment. When he hung up, his expression was grim. That was my clerk. I asked him to pull the federal civil rights complaint statistics for this county. Mr. Williams, you're not the only one. There have been 7 similar complaints filed in the past 2 years, all involving black homeowners being harassed by community associations. All involving selective enforcement of rules. Marcus felt his heart sink and soar at the same time. Sink because other people were going through the same hell he'd been living. Soar because he wasn't alone, wasn't imagining things, and wasn't being paranoid. Patricia was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I never meant for it to be about race. I just wanted to maintain standards. Intent doesn't matter, Judge Coleman repeated. Impact does. And the impact has been systematic discrimination against black residents. Frank Dalton stepped forward, his voice heavy with shame. Judge Coleman, what do we need to do to make this right? First, Ms. Hendricks needs to resign from the association board immediately. Second, every violation notice sent to Mr. Williams needs to be rescinded and any fines refunded. Third, the association needs to implement fair enforcement procedures with oversight to prevent future discrimination. Marcus looked around at the faces staring at him, some ashamed, some angry, some just beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been happening. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. And fourth, Judge Coleman continued, Mr. Williams deserves a formal apology from this association and a guarantee that this harassment will never happen again. Patricia wiped her eyes and looked directly at Marcus for the first time that morning. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. But Marcus wasn't sure sorry was enough. Not after 18 months of letters and complaints and phone calls. Not after being made to feel like a criminal in his own home. Not after having police officers show up at his nephew's birthday party. The morning sun was getting higher, reflecting off the lake water like scattered diamonds. What had started as another attempt to intimidate him had become something much bigger, a reckoning that would ripple through the entire community. But the biggest shock was still coming. Because Judge Coleman had one more piece of information that would change everything they thought they knew about Marcus Williams and why he'd really bought this cabin by the lake. Judge Coleman checked his watch and looked out over the lake one more time. The morning that had started with intimidation had turned into a lesson about civil rights. But there was still one more truth that needed to come out. Ms. Hendricks, he said quietly, before you resign and this community moves forward, there's something else you need to know about your neighbor here. Marcus shot him a warning look. But Judge Coleman nodded reassuringly. Mr. Williams, I think it's time they understood who they've really been harassing. Patricia wiped her eyes and looked confused. What do you mean? Marcus sighed and sat down on his dock, his legs hanging over the edge. "Judge, are you sure about this?" "After what they've put you through, yes. I'm sure." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the water lap against the shore. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Marcus Williams. I'm 54 years old. I worked at the steel plant for 20 years, saved every penny I could, and bought this cabin to have a peaceful place for my family." He paused, looking directly at Patricia. "But that's not the whole story." Judge Coleman stepped closer. "Tell them about your son, Marcus." Marcus's voice grew softer. "My son David was a police officer. Birmingham Police Department. He was killed in the line of duty 3 years ago, trying to stop an armed robbery at a convenience store." The group fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a heavy blanket. "David always dreamed of having a place like this," Marcus continued. "Somewhere peaceful where he could bring his kids fishing. Somewhere away from the city, away from the violence and the stress. We used to look at cabins online together, planning for when he retired." Patricia's hand went to her mouth. "After David died, his life insurance policy and the department's death benefit gave me enough money to finally buy this place. Not for me, for his memory, for the dream he never got to live." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed them a photo. A young black man in a police uniform, smiling proudly next to an older man who looked just like Marcus. "That's David on graduation day from the police academy. Proudest day of my life." His voice cracked slightly. "He became a cop because he wanted to make things better. He wanted to be the kind of officer who built bridges between communities, who showed that law enforcement could be fair and just." Sergeant Torres stepped forward, his face pale. "Sir, I remember reading about Officer Williams. He was killed trying to protect civilians. He saved 4 people that day." Marcus nodded. 4 people got to go home to their families because my son gave his life for them. And you know what? 3 of those 4 people were white." Judge Coleman's voice was heavy with emotion. "Marcus bought this cabin as a memorial to his son. The dock where you've been measuring for violations? That's where he spreads David's favorite fishing lures every year on the anniversary of his death." Patricia was openly sobbing now. "The fire pit you complained about?" Marcus continued. "David and I built one just like it in our backyard when he was 12 years old. We spent hours sitting around it, talking about his dreams, his hopes for the future." Frank Dalton was staring at the ground, his shoulders shaking. Marcus stood up from the dock and walked back to the group. "So when you sent me 17 violation notices in 18 months, when you called the police on my nephew's birthday party, when you suggested I might be more comfortable somewhere else, you weren't just harassing a random black man who bought a cabin?" His voice grew stronger. "You were telling the father of a fallen police officer that his son's memory wasn't welcome in your neighborhood." One of the police officers, tears visible in his eyes, stepped forward and saluted Marcus. "Sir, on behalf of law enforcement, I want to say how sorry I am. Your son was a hero and you deserve nothing but respect." Judge Coleman pulled out an official-looking document. "There's one more thing. Marcus, you didn't tell them about the scholarship." Marcus shook his head. "Judge, that's not necessary." "Yes, it is." Judge Coleman looked at Patricia and the board members. "The David Williams Memorial Scholarship Fund. Marcus has donated over $50,000 to help minority students attend police academies across the South. Money that came from his son's life insurance, from his own savings, from working overtime shifts at the steel plant." Patricia could barely speak through her tears. Why didn't you tell us?" Marcus's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I shouldn't have to prove my worth to live in peace. Because a man's value isn't measured by his tragedy or his contributions. Because in America, every person, regardless of color, should be able to buy a home and live there without harassment." Judge Coleman nodded approvingly. "And that, Ms. Hendricks, is exactly why federal civil rights laws exist. To protect people like Marcus from people who think they need to earn their right to exist in certain spaces." Sergeant Torres walked over to Marcus and extended his hand. "Sir, I want to apologize personally. We should never have been used as tools of intimidation against you or anyone else." Marcus shook his hand. "Apology accepted, Sergeant. But make sure this never happens again. To me or to anyone else." Frank Dalton finally found his voice. "Marcus, I'm ashamed. We're all ashamed. What can we do to make this right?" Marcus looked around at the faces staring at him. Faces that had gone from hostile to horrified to heartbroken in the space of a few hours. You can start by treating every resident fairly, regardless of their skin color. You can apologize to the other black families you've harassed. And you can remember that behind every door you knock on, there's a human being with their own story, their own struggles, and their own right to peace. Judge Coleman gathered up the evidence they'd reviewed. The federal investigation will proceed, but I'm hopeful that this community has learned something important today. Patricia walked up to Marcus, her face streaked with tears. Marcus, there are no words. I am so deeply sorry. For the letters, for the harassment, for everything. Your son would be proud of how you handled this. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Patricia, my son believed that people could change, that understanding could overcome prejudice. I hope he was right. As the police officers and board members began to leave, Judge Coleman put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. You did good today, my friend. David would be proud. Marcus looked out over the lake, peaceful again in the late morning sun. Judge, when I bought this place, I just wanted somewhere quiet to remember my son. I never expected to have to fight for that, right? The fight isn't over, Judge Coleman said quietly. But maybe, just maybe, the next black family who moves to this lake won't have to fight it at all. Marcus nodded, thinking about David's dream of a peaceful place by the water. The dream had been delayed, interrupted by ignorance and prejudice, but it wasn't destroyed. Not as long as he was willing to stand up for it. The morning that had started with intimidation had ended with truth. And sometimes, Marcus realized, truth was the most powerful weapon of all. As the last car pulled out of his driveway, Marcus walked back to his dock and sat down, his legs hanging over the edge. The lake was quiet again, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Somewhere in that reflection, he could almost see David smiling, proud of his father for fighting not just for himself, but for everyone who would come after him. The cabin by the lake was still his. But more importantly, it was still a place where dreams could come true, even the ones that took a little longer than expected. If this story moved you, remember that discrimination still happens in neighborhoods across America. But when good people stand up to injustice, when communities choose understanding over fear, change is possible. And if you want more stories about courage and standing up for what's right, don't forget to subscribe.